About the year 1822. I resided in a comfortable and roomy old house, the exact locality of which I need not particularize, further than to say that it was not very far from Old Brompton. In the immediate neighborhood, or rather continuity, as even my Connemara readers perfectly well know, of the renowned city of London. Though this house was roomy and comfortable, as I have said, it was not, by any means, a handsome one. It was composed of dark red brick, with small windows, and thick white sashes, a porch, too none of your flimsy trellis work, but a solid projection of the same vermilion masonry surmounted by a leaded balcony, with heavy, half-rotten balustrades, darkened the hall door with a perennial gloom. The mansion itself stood in a walled enclosure, which had, perhaps, from the date of the erection itself, been devoted to shrubs and flowers. Some of the former had grown there almost to the dignity of trees, and two dark little youths stood at each side of the porch, like swart and inauspicious dwarfs, guarding the entrance of an enchanted castle. Not that my domicile in any respect deserved the comparison. It had no reputation as a haunted house. If it ever had any ghosts, nobody remembered them. Its history was not known to me. It may have witnessed plots, cabals, and forgeries, bloody suicides and cruel murders. It was certainly old enough to have become acquainted with iniquity. A small stone slab, under the balustrade, and over the arch of the porch I mentioned, had the date 1672, and a half-effaced coat of arms, which I might have deciphered any day, had I taken the trouble to get a ladder, but always put it off. All I can say for the house is, that it was well stricken in years, with a certain air of somber comfort about it. Contained a vast number of rooms and closets, and, what was of far greater importance, was got by me a dead bargain. Its individuality attracted me. I grew fond of it for itself, and for its associations, until other associations of a hateful kind first disturbed, and then destroyed, their charm. I forgave its dull red brick, and pinched white windows, for the sake of the beloved and cheerful faces within. Its ugliness was softened by its age, and its somber evergreens, and moss-grown stone flower pots, were relieved by the brilliant hues of 1,000 gay and graceful flowers that peeped among them, or nodded over the grass. Within that old house lay my life's treasure. I had a darling little girl of 9, and another little darling a boy just 4 years of age, and dearer, unspeakably, than either a wife the prettiest, gayest, best little wife in all London. When I tell you that our income was scarcely £380 a year, you will perceive that our establishment cannot have been a magnificent one. Yet, I do assure you, we were more comfortable than a great many lords, and happier, I dare say, than the whole peerage put together. This happiness was not, however, what it ought to have been. The reader will understand at once, and save me a world of moralizing circumlocution, when he learns, bluntly and nakedly, that, among all my comforts and blessings, I was an infidel. I had not been without religious training. On the contrary, more than average pains had been bestowed upon my religious instruction from my earliest childhood. My father, a good, plain, country clergyman, had worked hard to make me as good as himself, and had succeeded, at least, in training me in godly habits. He died, however, when I was but 12 years of age, and fate had long before deprived me of the gentle care of a mother. A boarding school, followed by a college life, where nobody having any very direct interest in realizing in my behalf the ancient blessing, that in fullness of time I should die a good old man, I was left very much to my own devices, which, in truth, were none of the best. Among these were the study of Voltaire, Tom Paine, Hume, Shelley, and the whole school of infidels, poetical as well as prose. This pursuit, and the all but blasphemous vehemence with which I gave myself up to it, was, perhaps, partly reactionary. A somewhat injudicious austerity and precision had indissolubly associated in my childish days the ideas of restraint and gloom with religion. I bore it a grudge, and so, when I became thus early my own master, I set about paying off, after my own fashion, the old score I owed it. I was besides, like every other young infidel whom it has been my fate to meet, a conceited coxcomb, a smattering of literature, without any real knowledge, and a great assortment of all the cut and dry flippancies of the school I had embraced, constituted my intellectual stock in trade. I was, like most of my school of philosophy, very proud of being an unbeliever, and fancied myself, in the complacency of my wretched ignorance, at an immeasurable elevation above the church-going, Bible-reading herd, whom I treated with a good-humored superciliousness which I thought vastly indulgent. My wife was an excellent little creature and truly pious. She had married me in the full confidence that my levity was merely put on, and would at once give way before the influence she hoped to exert upon my mind. Poor little thing! She deceived herself. I allowed her, indeed, to do entirely as she pleased, but for myself, I carried my infidelity to the length of an absolute superstition. I made an ostentation of it. I would rather have been in a hell than in a church on Sunday. And though I did not prevent my wife's instilling her own principles into the minds of our children, I, in turn, took a special care to deliver mine upon all occasions in their hearing, by which means I trusted to sow the seeds of that unprejudiced skepticism in which I prided myself, at least as early as my good little partner dropped those of her own gentle superstition into their infant minds. Had I had my own absurd and impious will in this matter, my children should have had absolutely no religious education whatsoever, and been left wholly unshackled to choose for themselves among all existing systems, infidelity included, precisely as chance, fancy, or interest might hereafter determine. It is not to be supposed that such a state of things did not afford her great uneasiness. Nevertheless, we were so very fond of one another, and in our humble way enjoyed so many blessings, that we were as entirely happy as any pair can be without the holy influence of religious sympathy. But the even flow of prosperity which had for so long gladdened my little household was not destined to last forever. It was ordained that I should experience the bitter truth of more than one of the wise man's proverbs, and first, especially, of that which declares that, he that hateth suretyship is sure. I found myself involved, as how many have been before, by a good-natured friend, for more than £200. This agreeable intelligence was conveyed to me in an attorney's letter, which, to obviate unpleasant measures, considerately advised my paying the entire amount within just 1 week of the date of his pleasant epistle. Had I been called upon within that time to produce the Pitt diamond, or to make title to the Buckingham estates, the demand would have been just as easily complied with. I have no wish to bore my reader further with this little worry, a very serious one to me, however, and it will be enough to mention that the kindness of a friend extricated me from the clutches of the law by a timely advance, which, however, I was bound to replace within 2 years. To enable me to fulfill this engagement, my wife and I, after repeated consultations, resolved upon the course which resulted in the odd and unpleasant consequences which form the subject of this narrative. We resolved to advertise for a lodger, with or without board, and by resolutely submitting, for a single year, to the economy we had prescribed for ourselves, as well as to the annoyance of a stranger's intrusion, we calculated that at the end of that term we should have liquidated our debt. Accordingly, without losing time, we compose an advertisement in the most tempting phraseology we could devise, consistently with that economic laconism which the cost per line in the columns of the Times newspaper imposes upon the rhetoric of the advertising public. Somehow we were unlucky, for although we repeated our public notification 3 times in the course of a fortnight, we had but 2 applications. The one was from a clergyman in ill health, a man of great ability and zealous piety, whom we both knew by reputation, and who has since been called to his rest. My good little wife was very anxious that we should close with his offer, which was very considerably under what we had fixed upon. And I have no doubt that she was influenced by the hope that his talents and zeal might exert a happy influence upon my stubborn and unbelieving heart. For my part, his religious character displeased me. I did not wish my children's heads to be filled with mythic dogmas, for so I judged the doctrines of our holy faith, and instinctively wished them away. I therefore declined his offer, and I have often since thought not quite so graciously as I ought to have done. The other offer, if so it can be called, was so very inadequate that we could not entertain it. I was now beginning to grow seriously uneasy. Our little project, so far from bringing in the gains on which we had calculated, had put me considerably out of pocket, for, independently of the cost of the advertisement I have mentioned, there were sundry little expenses involved in preparing for the meet reception of our expected inmate, which, under ordinary circumstances, we should not have dreamed of. Matters were in this posture, when an occurrence took place which immediately revived my flagging hopes. As we had no superfluity of servants, our children were early obliged to acquire habits of independence, and my little girl, then just 9 years of age, was frequently consigned with no other care than that of her own good sense, to the companionship of a little band of playmates, pretty similarly circumstanced, with whom it was her wont to play. Having one fine summer afternoon gone out as usual with these little companions, she did not return quite so soon as we had expected her. When she did so, she was out of breath, and excited. "Oh, Papa," she said, "I have seen such a nice old, kind gentleman, and he told me to tell you that he has a particular friend who wants a lodging in a quiet place, and that he thinks your house would suit him exactly, and ever so much more. And, look here," he gave me this. She opened her hand, and showed me a sovereign. "Well, this does look promisingly," I said, my wife and I having first exchanged a smiling glance. "And what kind of gentleman was he, dear?" inquired she. "Was he well dressed? Whom was he like?" "He was not like anyone that I know," she answered, "but he had very nice new clothes on, and he was one of the fattest men I ever saw. And I am sure he is sick, for he looks very pale, and he had a crutch beside him." "Dear me, how strange!" exclaimed my wife, though, in truth there was nothing very wonderful in the matter. "Go on, child," I said, "let us hear it all out." "Well, Papa, he had such an immense yellow waistcoat. I never did see such a waistcoat," she resumed, "and he was sitting or leaning, I can't say which, against the bank of the green lane, I suppose to rest himself, for he seems very weak, poor gentleman." "And how did you happen to speak to him?" asked my wife. "When we were passing by. None of us saw him at all, but I suppose he heard them talking to me, and saying my name, for he said, 'Fanny, little Fanny, so, that's your name, come here, child. I have a question to ask you.' And so you went to him?" I said. "Yes," she continued, "he beckoned to me, and I did go over to him, but not very near. for I was greatly afraid of him at first. Afraid, dear, and why afraid? Asked I. I was afraid, because he looked very old, very frightful. And as if he would hurt me. What was there so old and frightful about him? I asked. She paused and reflected a little, and then said, his face was very large and pale, and it was looking upwards. It seemed very angry, I thought, but maybe it was angry from pain. And sometimes one side of it used to twitch and tremble for a minute, and then to grow quite still again. And all the time he was speaking to me, he never looked at me once, but always kept his face and eyes turned upwards. But his voice was very soft, and he called me Little Fanny. And gave me this pound to buy toys with, so I was not so frightened in a little time, and then he sent a long message to you, Papa, and told me if I forgot it he would beat me. But I knew he was only joking, so that did not frighten me either. And what was the message, my girl? I asked, patting her pretty head with my hand. Now, let me remember it all, she said. Reflectively, for he told it to me twice. He asked me if there was a good bedroom at the top of the house, standing by itself, and you know there is, so I told him so. It was exactly the kind of room that he described. And then he said that his friend would pay £200 a year for that bedroom, his board and attendance, and he told me to ask you. And have your answer when he should next meet me. £200, ejaculated my poor little wife. Why, that is nearly twice as much as we expected. But did he say that his friend was sick? Or very old? Or that he had any servant to be supported also? I asked. Oh, no. He told me that he was quite able to take care of himself, and that he had, I think he called it, an asthma. But nothing else the matter, and that he would give no trouble at all, and that any friend who came to see him, he would see, not in the house, but only in the garden. In the garden, I echoed, laughing in spite of myself. Yes, indeed he said so, and he told me to say that he would pay £100 when he came here, and the next 106 months, and so on, continued she. Oh, half yearly in advance, better and better, said I, and he bid me say, too, if you should ask about his character, that he is just as good as the master of the house himself, she added. And when he said that, he laughed a little. Why, if he gives us £100 in advance, I answered, turning to my wife, we are safe enough. For he will not find half that value in plate and jewels in the entire household, if he is disposed to rob us. So I see no reason against closing with the offer, should it be seriously meant. Do you? Dear, quite the contrary, love, said she. I think it most desirable indeed, most providential. Providential, my dear little bigot, I repeated, with a smile. Well, be it so. I call it lucky merely, but, perhaps, you are happier in your faith, than I in my philosophy. Yes, you are grateful for the chance that I only rejoice at. You receive it as a proof of a divine and tender love, I as an accident. Delusions are often more elevating than truth. And so saying, I kissed away the saddened cloud that for a moment overcast her face. Papa, he bid me be sure to have an answer for him when we meet again, resumed the child. What shall I say to him when he asks me? Say that we agree to his proposal, my dear, or stay, I said, addressing my wife, may it not be prudent to reduce what the child says to writing, and accept the offer so? This will prevent misunderstanding, as she may possibly have made some mistake. My wife agreed, and I wrote a brief note, stating that I was willing to receive an inmate upon the terms recounted by little Fanny, and which I distinctly specified. so that no mistake could possibly arise owing to the vagueness of what lawyers term a parole agreement. This important memorandum I placed in the hands of my little girl, who was to deliver it whenever the old gentleman in the yellow waistcoat should chance to meet her. And all these arrangements completed, I awaited the issue of the affair with as much patience as I could affect. Meanwhile, my wife and I talked it over incessantly, and she, good little soul, almost wore herself to death in settling and unsettling the furniture and decorations of our expected inmates' apartments. Days passed away, days of hopes deferred, tedious and anxious. We were beginning to despond again, when one morning our little girl ran into the breakfast parlor, more excited even than she had been before, and fresh from a new interview with the gentleman in the yellow waistcoat. She had encountered him suddenly, pretty nearly where she had met him before, and the result was that he had read the little note I have mentioned, and desired the child to inform me that his friend, Mr. Smith, would take possession of the apartments I proposed setting on the terms agreed between us, that very evening. This evening, exclaimed my wife and I simultaneously, full of the idea of making a first installment on the day following, of the 101 preparations which still remained to be completed. And so Smith is his name. Well, that does not tell us much, said I. But where did you meet your friend on this occasion? And how long is it since? Near the corner of the wallflower lane, so we indicated one which abounded in these fragrant plants. He was leaning with his back against the old tree you cut my name on, and his crutch was under his arm. But how long ago? I urged. Only this moment. I ran home as fast as I could, she replied. Why, you little blockhead! You should have told me that at first, I cried, snatching up my hat, and darting away in pursuit of the yellow waistcoat, whose acquaintance I not unnaturally coveted, inasmuch as a man who, for the first time, admits a stranger into his house, on the footing of permanent residence, desires generally to know a little more about him than that his name is Smith. The place indicated was only, as we say, a step away, and as yellow waistcoat was fat, and used a crutch, I calculated on easily overtaking him. I was, however, disappointed. Crutch, waistcoat, and all had disappeared. I climbed to the top of the wall, and from this commanding point of view made a sweeping observation, but in vain. I returned home, cursing my ill luck, the child's dullness, and the fat old fellow's activity. I need hardly say that Mr. Smith, in all his aspects, moral, social, physical, and monetary, formed a fruitful and interesting topic of speculation during dinner. How many phantom Smiths, short and long, stout and lean, ill-tempered and well-tempered, rich, respectable, or highly dangerous merchants, spies, forgers, nabobs, swindlers, danced before us in the endless mazes of fanciful conjecture, during that anxious tete-a-tete, which was probably to be interrupted by the arrival of the gentleman himself. My wife and I puzzled over the problem as people would over the possible denouement of a French novel, and at last, by mutual consent, we came to the conclusion that Smith could and would turn out to be no other than the good-natured valetudinarian in the yellow waistcoat himself, a humorist, as was evident enough, and a millionaire, as we unhesitatingly pronounced, who had no immediate relatives, and as I hoped, and my wife, was certain, taken a decided fancy to our little Fanny. I patted the child's head with something akin to pride, as I thought of the magnificent, though remote possibilities, in store for her. Meanwhile, hour after hour stole away. It was a beautiful autumn evening, and the amber luster of the declining sun fell softly upon the yews and flowers, and gave an air, half melancholy, half cheerful. To the dark red brick piers surmounted with their cracked and grass-grown stone urns, and furnished with the light foliage of untended creeping plants. Down the short broad walk leading to this somber entrance, my eye constantly wandered, but no impatient rattle on the latch, no battering at the gate, indicated the presence of a visitor. And the lazy bell hung dumbly among the honeysuckles. When will he come? Yellow Waistcoat promised this evening. It has been evening a good hour and a half, and yet he is not here. When will he come? It will soon be dark, the evening will have passed, will he come at all? Such were the uneasy speculations which began to trouble us. Redder and duskier grew the light of the setting sun, till it saddened into the mists of night. Twilight came, and then darkness, and still no arrival, no summons at the gate. I would not admit even to my wife the excess of my own impatience. I could, however, stand it no longer, so I took my hat and walked to the gate, where I stood by the side of the public road, watching every vehicle and person that approached, in a fever of expectation. Even these, however, began to fail me, and the road grew comparatively quiet and deserted. Having kept guard like a sentinel for more than half an hour, I returned in no very good humor. With the punctuality of an expected inmate, ordered the servant to draw the curtains and secure the hall door. And so my wife and I sat down to our disconsolate cup of tea. It must have been about 10 o'clock, and we were both sitting silently, she working, I looking moodily into a paper, and neither of us any longer entertaining a hope that anything but disappointment would come of the matter, when a sudden tapping, very loud and sustained, upon the window pane, startled us both in an instant from our reveries. I am not sure whether I mentioned before that the sitting room we occupied was upon the ground floor, and the sward came close under the window. I drew the curtains, and opened the shutters with a revived hope, and looking out, saw a very tall thin figure, a good deal wrapped up, standing about a yard before me, and motioning with head and hand impatiently towards the hall door. Though the night was clear, there was no moon, and therefore I could see no more than the black outline, like that of an ombre chinois figure, signing to me with mop and mow. In a moment I was at the hall door, candle in hand. The stranger stepped in, his long fingers clutched in the handle of a valise, and a bag which trailed upon the ground behind him. The light fell full upon him. He wore a long, ill-made, black surtout, buttoned across, and which wrinkled and bagged about his lank figure. His hat was none of the best, and rather broad in the brim. A sort of white woolen muffler enveloped the lower part of his face. A pair of prominent green goggles, fenced round with leather, completely concealed his eyes, and nothing of the genuine man, but a little bit of yellow forehead, and a small transverse segment of equally yellow cheek and nose, encountered the curious gaze of your humble servant. You are, I suppose, I began, for I really was a little doubtful about my man. Mr. Smith, the same. Be good enough to show me to my bedchamber, interrupted the stranger, brusquely, and in a tone which, spite of the muffler that enveloped his mouth, was sharp and grating enough. Ha, Mr. Smith, so I supposed. I hope you may find everything as comfortable as we desire to make it. I was about making a speech, but was cut short by a slight bow, and a decisive gesture of the hand in the direction of the staircase. It was plain that the stranger hated ceremony. Together, accordingly, we mounted the staircase, he still pulling his luggage after him, and striding lightly up without articulating a word, and on reaching his bedroom, he immediately removed his hat, showing a sinister black scratch wig underneath, and then began unrolling the mighty woolen wrapping of his mouth and chin. Come, thought I, we shall see something of your face after all. This something, however, proved to be very little, for under his muffler was a loose cravat, which stood up in front of his chin, and upon his mouth he wore a respirator, an instrument which I had never seen before, and of the use of which I was wholly ignorant. There was something so excessively odd in the effect of this piece of unknown mechanism upon his mouth, surmounted by the huge goggles which encased his eyes, that I believe I should have laughed outright, were it not for a certain unpleasant and peculiar impressiveness in the taut ensemble of the narrow-chested, long-limbed, and cadaverous figure in black. As it was, we stood looking at one another in silence for several seconds. "Thank you, sir," at last he said, abruptly. "I shan't want anything whatever tonight. If you can only spare me the scandal." I assented, and, becoming more communicative, he added, "I am, though an invalid, an independent sort of fellow enough. I am a bit of a philosopher. I am my own servant, and, I hope, my own master, too. I rely upon myself in matters of the body and of the mind. I place valets and priests in the same category, fellows who live by our laziness, intellectual or corporeal. I am a Voltaire, without his luxuries a Robinson Crusoe, without his Bible an anchorite, without a superstition. In short, my indulgence is asceticism, and my faith infidelity. Therefore, I shan't disturb your servants much with my bell, nor yourselves with my samodi. You have got a rational lodger, who knows how to attend upon himself." During this singular address he was drawing off his ill-fitting black gloves, and when he had done so, a bank note, which had been slipped underneath for safety, remained in his hand. "Punctuality, sir, is one of my poor pleasures," he said. "Will you allow me to enjoy it now? Tomorrow you may acknowledge this. I should not rest were you to decline it." He extended his bony and discolored fingers, and placed the note in my hand. Oh, Fortune and Plutus! It was a £100 bank note. "Pray, not one word. My dear sir," he continued, unbending still further, "it is simply done pursuant to agreement. We shall know one another better, I hope, in a little time. You will find me always equally punctual. At present pray give yourself no further trouble. I require nothing more. Good night." I returned the valediction, closed his door, and groped my way down the stairs. It was not until I had nearly reached the hall, that I recollected that I had omitted to ask our new inmate at what hour he would desire to be called in the morning, and so I groped my way back again. As I reached the lobby on which his chamber opened, I perceived a long line of light issuing from the partially opened door, within which stood Mr. Smith, the same odd figure I had just left, while along the boards was creeping towards him across the lobby, a great, big-headed, buff-colored cat. I had never seen this ugly animal before, and it had reached the threshold of his door, arching its back, and rubbing itself on the post, before either appeared conscious of my approach, when, with an angry growl, it sprang into the stranger's room. "What do you want?" he demanded, sharply, standing in the doorway. I explained my errand. "I shall call myself," was his sole reply, and he shut the door with a crash that indicated no very pleasurable emotions. I cared very little about my lodger's temper. The stealthy rustle of his bank note in my waistcoat pocket was music enough to sweeten the harshest tones of his voice, and to keep alive a cheerful good humor in my heart. And although there was, indisputably, something queer about him, I was, on the whole, very well pleased with my bargain. The next day our new inmate did not ring his bell until noon. As soon as he had had some breakfast, of which he very sparingly partook, he told the servant that, for the future, He desired that a certain quantity of milk and bread might be left outside his door, and this being done, he would dispense with regular meals. He desired, too, that, on my return, I should be acquainted that he wished to see me in his own room at about 9 o'clock, and, meanwhile, he directed that he should be left undisturbed. I found my little wife full of astonishment at Mr. Smith's strange frugality and seclusion, and very curious to learn the object of the interview he had desired with me. At 9 o'clock I repaired to his room. I found him in precisely the costume in which I had left him, the same green goggles, the same muffling of the mouth. Except that being now no more than a broadly folded black silk handkerchief, very loose, and covering even the lower part of the nose, it was obviously intended for the sole purpose of concealment. It was plain I was not to see more of his features than he had chosen to disclose at our first interview. The effect was as if the lower part of his face had some hideous wound or so. He closed the door with his own hand on my entrance, nodded slightly, and took his seat. I expected him to begin, but he was so long silent that I was at last constrained to address him. I said, for want of something more to the purpose, that I hoped he had not been tormented by the strange cat the night before. What cat? He asked, abruptly. What the plague do you mean? Why, I certainly did see a cat go into your room last night, I resumed. Hey, and what if you did, though I fancy you dreamed it. I'm not afraid of a cat. Are you? He interrupted, tartly. At this moment there came a low growling mew from the closet which opened from the room in which we sat. Talk of the devil, said I, pointing towards the closet. My companion, without any exact change of expression, looked, I thought, somehow still more sinister and lowering, and I felt for a moment a sort of superstitious misgiving, which made the rest of the sentence die away on my lips. Perhaps Mr. Smith perceived this, for he said, in a tone calculated to reassure me, well, sir, I think I am bound to tell you that I like my apartments very well. They suit me. And I shall probably be your tenant for much longer than at first you anticipated. I expressed my gratification. He then began to talk. Something in the strain in which he had spoken of his own peculiarities of habit and thinking upon the previous evening. He disposed of all classes and denominations of superstition with an easy sarcastic slang, which for me was so captivating, that I soon lost all reserve, and found myself listening and suggesting by turns, acquiescent and pleased, sometimes hazarding dissent, but whenever I did, foiled and flawed by a few pointed satirical sentences, whose sophistry, for such I must now believe it, confounded me with a rapidity which, were it not for the admiration with which he had insensibly inspired me, would have piqued and irritated my vanity not a little. While this was going on, from time to time the mewing and growling of a cat within the closet became more and more audible. At last these sounds became so loud, accompanied by scratching at the door, that I paused in the midst of a sentence, and observed, there certainly is a cat shut up in the closet. Is there? He ejaculated, in a surprised tone. Nay, I do not hear it. He rose abruptly and approached the door. His back was towards me, but I observed he raised the goggles which usually covered his eyes, and looked steadfastly at the closet door. The angry sounds all died away into a low, protracted growl, which again subsided into silence. He continued in the same attitude for some moments, and then returned. I do not hear it, he said, as he resumed his place, and taking a book from his capacious pocket, asked me if I had seen it before. I never had, and this surprised me, for I had flattered myself that I knew, at least by name, every work published in England during the last 50 years in favor of that philosophy in which we both delighted. The book, moreover, was an odd one, as both its title and table of contents demonstrated. While we were discoursing upon these subjects, I became more and more distinctly conscious of a new class of sounds proceeding from the same closet. I plainly heard a measured and heavy tread, accompanied by the tapping of some hard and heavy substance like the end of a staff, pass up and down the floor first, as it seemed, stealthily, and then more and more inconcealedly. I began to feel very uncomfortable and suspicious. As the noise proceeded, and became more and more unequivocal, Mr. Smith abruptly rose, opened the closet door, just enough to admit his own lath-like person, and steal within the threshold for some seconds. What he did I could not see. I felt conscious he had an associate concealed there. And though my eyes remained fixed on the book, I could not avoid listening for some audible words, or signal of caution. I heard, however, nothing of the kind. Mr. Smith turned back, walked a step or two towards me, and said, "I fancied I heard a sound from that closet, but there is nothing whatever. Bring the candle. Let us both look." I obeyed with some little trepidation, for I fully anticipated that I should detect the intruder, of whose presence my own ears had given me, for nearly half an hour, the most unequivocal proofs. We entered the closet together. It contained but a few chairs and a small spider table. At the far end of the room there was a sort of grey woolen cloth upon the floor, and a bundle of something underneath it. I looked jealously at it, and half thought I could trace the outline of a human figure. But, if so, it was perfectly motionless. "Some of my poor wardrobe," he muttered, as he pointed his lean finger in the direction. "It did not sound like a cat, did it? Hey, did it?" he muttered, and without attending to my answer, he went about the apartment, clapping his hands, and crying, "Hish, hish, hish." The game, however, whatever it was, did not start. As I entered I had seen, however, a large crutch reposing against the wall in the corner opposite to the door. This was the only article in the room, except that I have mentioned, with which I was not familiar. With the exception of our two selves, there was not a living creature to be seen there. No shadow but ours upon the bare walls, no feet but our own upon the comfortless floor. I had never before felt so strange and unpleasant a sensation. "There is nothing unusual in the room but that crutch," I said. "What crutch, you dolt?" "I see no crutch," he ejaculated, in a tone of sudden but suppressed fury. "Why, that crutch," I answered, for somehow I neither felt nor resented his rudeness, turning and pointing to the spot where I had seen it. It was gone. It was neither there nor anywhere else. It must have been an illusion, rather an odd one, to be sure. And yet I could at this moment, with a safe conscience, swear that I never saw an object more distinctly than I had seen it but a second before. My companion was muttering fast to himself as we withdrew. His presence rather scared than reassured me. And I felt something almost amounting to horror, as, holding the candle above his cadaverous and sable figure, he stood at his threshold, while I descended the stairs, and said, in a sort of whisper, "Why, but that I am, like yourself, a philosopher, I should say that your house is as a haunted. You look very pale, my love," said my wife, as I entered the drawing room, where she had been long awaiting my return. "Nothing unpleasant has happened, nothing, I assure you." "Pale? Do I look pale?" answered. "We are excellent friends, I assure you. So far from having had the smallest disagreement, there is every prospect of our agreeing but too well, as you will say. for I find that he holds all my opinions upon speculative subjects. We have had a great deal of conversation this evening, I assure you, and I never met, I think, so scholarlike and able a man. I am sorry for it, dearest, she said, sadly. The greater his talents, if such be his opinions, the more dangerous a companion is he. We turned, however, to more cheerful topics, and it was late before we retired to rest. I believe it was pride, perhaps only vanity, but, at all events, some obstructive and stubborn instinct of my nature, which I could not overcome, that prevented my telling my wife the odd occurrences which had disturbed my visit to our guest. I was unable or ashamed to confess that so slight a matter had disturbed me. And, above all, that any accident could possibly have clouded, even for a moment, the frosty clearness of my pure and lofty skepticism with the shadows of superstition. Almost every day seemed to develop some new eccentricity of our strange guest. His dietary consisted, without any variety or relief, of the monotonous bread and milk with which he started. His bed had not been made for nearly a week. Nobody had been admitted into his room since my visit, just described, and he never ventured downstairs, or out of doors, until after nightfall, when he used sometimes to glide swiftly round a little enclosed shrubbery, and at others stand quite motionless, composed, as if in an attitude of deep attention. After employing about an hour in this way, he would return, and steal upstairs to his room, when he would shut himself up, and not be seen again until the next night, or, it might be, the night after that, when, perhaps, he would repeat his odd excursion. Strange as his habits were, their eccentricity was all upon the side least troublesome to us. He required literally no attendance, and as to his occasional night ramble, even it caused not the slightest disturbance of our routine hour for securing the house and locking up the hall door for the night, inasmuch as he had invariably retired before that hour arrived. All this stimulated curiosity, and, in no small degree, that of my wife, who, notwithstanding her vigilance and her anxiety to see our strange inmate, had been hitherto foiled by a series of cross accidents. We were sitting together somewhere about 10 o'clock at night, when there came a tap at the room door. We had just been discussing the unaccountable Smith, and I felt a sheepish consciousness that he might be himself at the door, and have possibly even overheard our speculation, some of them anything but complimentary, respecting himself. "Come in," cried I, with an effort, and the tall form of our lodger glided into the room. My wife was positively frightened, and stood looking at him, as he advanced, with a stare of manifest apprehension, and even recoiled mechanically, and caught my hand. Sensitiveness, however, was not his fault. He made a kind of stiff nod as I mumbled an introduction, and seating himself unasked, began at once to chat in that odd, off-hand, and sneering style, in which he excelled, and which had, as he wielded it, a sort of fascination of which I can pretend to convey no idea. My wife's alarm subsided, and although she still manifestly felt some sort of misgiving about our visitor, she yet listened to his conversation, and, spite of herself, soon began to enjoy it. He stayed for nearly half an hour. But although he glanced at a great variety of topics, he did not approach the subject of religion. As soon as he was gone, my wife delivered judgment upon him in form. She admitted he was agreeable. But then he was such an unnatural, awful-looking object. There was, besides, something indescribably frightful, she thought, in his manner. The very tone of his voice was strange and hateful, and, on the whole, she felt unutterably relieved at his departure. A few days after, on my return, I found my poor little wife agitated and dispirited. Mr. Smith had paid her a visit and brought with him a book, which he stated he had been reading, and which contained some references to the Bible which he begged of her to explain in that profounder and less obvious sense in which they had been cited. This she had endeavored to do, and affecting to be much gratified by her satisfactory exposition, he had requested her to reconcile some discrepancies which he said had often troubled him when reading the scriptures. Some of them were quite new to my good little wife. They startled and even horrified her. He pursued this theme, still pretending only to seek for information to quiet his own doubts, while in reality he was sowing in her mind the seeds of the first perturbations that had ever troubled the sources of her peace. He had been with her, she thought, no more than a quarter of an hour. But he had contrived to leave her abundant topics on which to ruminate for days. I found her shocked and horrified at the doubts which this potent Magus had summoned from the pit, doubts which she knew not how to combat, and from the torment of which she could not escape. He has made me very miserable with his deceitful questions. I never thought of them before, and, merciful heaven, I cannot answer them. What am I to do? My serenity is gone. I shall never be happy again. In truth, she was so very miserable, and, as it seemed to me, so disproportionately excited, that, inconsistent in me as the task would have been, I would gladly have explained away her difficulties, and restored to her mind its wonted confidence and serenity, had I possessed sufficient knowledge for the purpose. I really pitied her, and heartily wished Mr. Smith, for the nonce, at the devil. I observed after this that my wife's spirits appeared permanently affected. There was a constantly recurring anxiety, and I thought something was lying still more heavily at her heart than the uncertainties inspired by our lodger. One evening, as we two were sitting together, after a long silence, she suddenly laid her hand upon my arm, and said, "Oh, Richard, my darling, would to God you could pray for me." There was something so agitated, and even terrified, in her manner, that I was absolutely startled. I urged her to disclose whatever preyed upon her mind. "You can't sympathize with me, you can't help me, you can scarcely compassionate me in my misery. Oh, dearest Richard, some evil influence has been gaining upon my heart, dulling and destroying my convictions, killing all my holy affections, and absolutely transforming me. I look inward upon myself with amazement, with terror, with oh, God, with actual despair." Saying this, she threw herself on her knees, and wept an agonized flood of tears, with her head reposing in my lap. Poor little thing, my heart bled for her. But what could I do or say? All I could suggest was what I really thought: that she was unwell, hysterical, and needed to take better care of her precious self; that her change of feeling was fancied, not real; and that a few days would restore her to her old health and former spirits and serenity. And sometimes, she resumed, after I had ended a consolatory discussion, which it was but too manifest had fallen unprofitably upon her ear, such dreadful, impious thoughts come into my mind, whether I choose it or not. They come, and stay, and return, strive as I may. And I can't pray against them. They are forced upon me with the strength of an independent will, and oh, horrible, frightful, they blaspheme the character of God Himself. They upbraid the Almighty upon His throne, and I can't pray against them. There is something in me now that resists prayer. There was such a real and fearful anguish in the agitation of my gentle companion, that it shook my very soul within me. Even while I was affecting to make light of her confessions, I had never before witnessed a struggle at all like this, and I was awestruck at the spectacle. At length she became comparatively calm. I did gradually succeed, though very imperfectly, in reassuring her. She strove hard against her depression, and recovered a little of her wonted cheerfulness. After a while, however, the cloud returned. She grew sad and earnest, though no longer excited, and entreated, or rather implored, of me to grant her one special favor, and this was, to avoid the society of our lodger. I never, she said, could understand till now the instinctive dread with which poor Margaret, in Faust, shrinks from the hateful presence of Mephistopheles. I now feel it in myself. The dislike and suspicion I first felt for that man Smith, or whatever else he may call himself, has grown into literal detestation and terror. I hate him, I am afraid of him, I never knew what anguish of mind was until he entered our doors, and would to God he were gone. I reasoned with her, kissed her, laughed at her, but could not dissipate, in the least degree, the intense and preternatural horror with which she had grown to regard the poor philosophic invalid, who was probably, at that moment, poring over some metaphysical book in his solitary bedchamber.